Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this Zoom webinar. I'm Jeff Mackler, the National Secretary of the political party called Socialist Action. And we have with us today the executive editor of the Black Agenda Report, Glen Ford. We're going to be talking about where this massive movement against racism, systemic racism, and police brutality is going. We had 15 to 26 million people in the streets over these past several weeks, and it appears that that intensity may be focused by some of the leaders on turning the movement back to electoral politics. I have in front of me a statement from the website of the Movement for Black Lives that says Black Lives Matters, What Matters 2020 is a campaign aimed to maximize the impact of the BLM movement by galvanizing BLM supporters and allies to the polls in the 2020 US presidential elections to build collective power. And then I have a further statement from Jessica Bird, who heads up the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives, who says that they want to focus on the electoral strategy at their upcoming Black National Convention to organize and build Black political power by engaging people in the voting and political process to make sure community demands are met. Glen, is this very prominent movement for Black Lives taking this movement down the electoral path of Democratic Party graveyard of the social movement politics?
Well, we have to make clear that there is a Black Lives Matter organization that has 14 chapters in the United States and 3 in Canada. And there is the Movement for Black Lives, which is a different organization. The Movement for Black Lives is basically made up at the core of NGOs, organizations that get their money from charitable contributions, NGOs. And it is basically inspired by Alicia Garza, one of the 3 young women who invented the hashtag Black Lives Matter, but they're different organizations. Alicia Garza has already shown that she is a Democratic Party operative. She intervened in the primary process, getting a petition together that charged Bernie Sanders and his people with being racist in the challenge of the Working Family Party's decision to support Elizabeth Warren. That was her jumping into the fray. She's clearly a Democratic Party operative, and that's what this endorsement of electoral politics is all about. That's where they're going. Garza also, through her organizations, created a Black census, which she says, and I'm sure it's true, was the first, the biggest rather, census of Black public opinion ever in history. But this Black census didn't ask one foreign policy question. It actually provided ample material for politicians and political parties to frame an approach to black folks electorally. It's an electoral politics tool that she would put in the hands of the Democratic Party. So we know where she's coming from. The Black Lives Matter organization, with its 14 chapters, is itself more of a quilt than a monolith. There's not a unanimity of opinion in Black Lives Matter beyond principles, but we shouldn't confuse Alicia Garza's Movement for Black Lives with the Black Lives Matter chapters. It also needs to be said that with 14 chapters, the Black Lives Matter organization was not wholly responsible for these multi-million person demonstrations that we witness. Black Lives Matter doesn't have, has only one chapter, for example, in the Deep South. And there are whole sections of the country that don't have any Black Lives Matter chapters, although these demonstrations were inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, I appreciate your making the distinctions that you have, but the question remains, where can this unprecedented mass movement go today? It obviously can't stay in the streets. It can't await another Kenosha, one of the daily police murders, to mobilize people every day. It needs to, it seems, find, establish, seek out, develop some kind of concrete form, if I may say, a Black political party or a organization of Blacks with a specific program aimed at concretizing the independent mobilization of Blacks against the systemic racism in society. Absent that, it can only end up dissipating, waiting for yet another police atrocity. How far are we away from establishing things like Black and Latino control of their own communities? What would it take to concretize a serious, ongoing, politically based, independent organization of the nation's most oppressed to move the struggle forward?
Well, to answer your question, where is this movement going? The answer is it's going in lots of places. It is, as you said, or in the beginning, the biggest mobilization of people in US history. And that's a lot of people, and a lot of people coming from a whole lot of different places and going to a lot of different places. But the sheer numbers make it a great leap forward. Many of these folks are going to be engaging in the kind of politics that you and I are engaged in. Others are going to be just more loyal Democrats. That's what happens when you get to 20 million people on the march. Lots of tendencies are engaged in that. In terms of how much closer we are to community control of the police, which is, I think, the most promising of the movements, and which has reached a highly developed stage in Chicago, where folks have been fighting for community control of the police for the better part of a decade. There's not unanimity within the Black Lives Matter chapters. I'm talking about the actual Black Lives Matter organization on that. Some of the chapters do support community control of the police. Others back away from taking that position, although still saying that they want to defund and abolish the police. Proponents of community control of police say that is how you, in fact, defund and eventually abolish the police, by putting the community in control, and the community decides what kind of security it wants to create for itself, and that is the democratic option that's available to the people.
You know, I hate to date myself, but I was in New York when Malcolm X was organizing, and he set a bit of a shockwave through the community by organizing the independent group that was not based on religion, the Organization of African American Unity. And that organization, as Malcolm portrayed it, was to be a substitute government in the Black community, not only policing, but to take on all of the social responsibilities that a government would do, except it would be a Black government, a government of the oppressed, a government organized to defend its own community, a government that would not rely on New York's white racist police. That was a time where there were massive mobilizations of the Black community, and the basic outlines, the form of a Black controlled community, neighborhood, state, or whatever, had a reality in the words of Malcolm X. What kind of institutional form is realistic, is possible, or are we still in today? Or are we still in the stages of discussing, coalescing, organizing conferences to see if we can present what really amounts to an alternative power to the power of the capitalist state, business people, elected officials that today control these communities for the profit of the few.
Well, Malcolm X, of course, understood the principle of self-determination, and self-determination is at root what underlies the demand for community control of the police. But what's so promising about this demand and so encouraging that there is an actual movement, there are groups in almost 100 cities across the country that are pushing for community control of the police. What's so promising about this is that the same principle that demands community control of the police would demand community control of schools, community control of all of the public services to that community. So when folks demand defunding of the police and say, well, these funds that we, or not we, actually city councils, would take away from the police should go into the budgets of community services. Well, many community services don't really serve the community. We remember quite well how the welfare system was often operated as an arm of oppression of the state. So under the same principle of self-determination, those community services ought to be controlled by the people who are the objects of those services, and certainly the schools. And you, of course, are a veteran of the fight for community control of the schools in New York City back in the 60s.
You're right. That struggle took place in 1968 in the context of the racist teacher strike conducted by Al Shanker's United Federation of Teachers. The reaction was that virtually every Black organization in the city, from the major unions that were Black, the SEI unions, the AFSCME unions, even organizations like the NAACP, organized to break that racist strike, which was based on the idea that the right of Blacks to control their schools, where they set up experimental districts in several parts of New York, including Ocean Hill, Brownsville, would be the governing bodies. That is, Blacks would control the school district. We should understand at the time that out of 900 schools in New York City, there was probably 2 or 3 Black and Puerto Rican principals. The other 99% were white. And even the lists leading to the seniority lists to who could be principal had no Blacks on them. And the schools were deteriorating. And the idea that Black education could be advanced by going to white schools, busing, where Blacks were met with white racist mobs and so on, was discredited. And the activists that literally physically took over the schools, probably a majority of the schools down that school, said we don't need to be equal by being designated as integrationists into white schools. We need to control our own schools, our own institutions, our own teachers, our own principals, if not the entire apparatus of the community. That was the question that was raised, but it was raised in the context of innumerable massive meetings of the oppressed that fought to keep the cops out of their schools, that fought to keep the racist union leaders from closing them down, from chaining them closed in order to advance the interests of the white racist leadership at that time. So community control was embodied in massive mobilizations of the oppressed to exercise this control, to physically occupy, to provide the teachers, the education, the guards, the security of the schools, and by implication, the broader community.
Well, community control of the schools, in fact, did exist in some fashion in Chicago. It was instituted back in the early 1980s under Mayor Harold Washington, but since then has been allowed to atrophy. But it is a live issue in Chicago, where community control of the police is on the front burner. After the last election of city aldermen, that's their city council, people who promised, pledged to support the community control of the police legislation now make up 19 of the 50 alder persons. Before the election, there was only one. And community control of the police has the support of the Chicago Teachers Union. So much of the chemistry is already in place in Chicago to fight not just for community control of the police, although that would be a great victory, but to extend that principle to the schools and to other agencies. So that's why I keep on talking about Chicago, because that is the model of what can be done. And what's important to note about Chicago is how they got there. They didn't get to that point where they are six people from a majority on a 50-person board of aldermen, and that's after just one election, simply by lobbying and going and trying to influence the Democratic Party machine that runs Chicago. What happened was activists said, we're able to mobilize 50 or 60,000 people to come to demonstrations in Chicago. And we've done this year after year. And this because of they've had this mammoth battle against police brutality in Chicago. So we've got a list of 50, 60,000 names. Let's put these people for this election to work and changing the nature of the city council. They were not jumping into electoral politics. They were using the human muscle that had already shown itself ready to disrupt the order for this specific project of changing the character of the city council. So at heart, this is movement politics that's at work in Chicago, and therefore has lessons for the larger movement that we see manifesting itself, or at least the beginnings of one, nationwide back in June.
In regard to Chicago, we have a number of friends in Chicago who spoke to some of the self-proclaimed socialists who won seats on the Board of Aldermen. And they went to public meetings and they said they were socialists, but they also said they were members of the Democratic Party, because in their particular communities, they thought it was an advantage to self-declare as socialists, but they were still part of the Democratic Party establishment. My vision, and I may be off the mark, of community control is the coalescence and emergence of the Black community through its own organizational forms, as opposed to, for example, a process where there's an election and whoever wins the election gets to control the police or oversee the police or set up a civilian review board or whatever. The vision that I have, hypothetically or in the future, is that the control would be exercised by Black people, the oppressed themselves, if not armed, to defend their communities against racist assaults, to defend their community against usurious landlords, to defend their community by fighting for the funds to provide education and healthcare and all the rest. That is the institutional organization of the Black community. Shockingly, I think the world learned some lessons as perhaps an alternative in this recent period when literally tens of millions of people including perhaps a majority white youth, went into the streets to stand shoulder to shoulder in the face of the pandemic, COVID-19, in solidarity with their Black sisters and brothers. That portended a kind of unity that none of us had ever experienced before. We saw the Black community as the vanguard, organizing independently to express its right to self-determination. And then we see unprecedented numbers of whites standing in solidarity saying, we support you. Could that portend a different form, a multiracial form, a working class overall form of a liberation movement, as opposed to what we have been looking for and hoping for decades, the initial independent organization of the Black community, like Malcolm projected, and even the Black Panthers for a short time in California. Where are we headed these days?
Well, some Black folks are uncomfortable with the huge number of white people who were marching and protesting in June. I'm not at all. Back in the 1960s and still today, the demand from Black activists of white comrades was that they take Black leadership. Well, all of those folks who were marching in June were taking Black leadership. They were mouthing Black Lives Matter slogans. They were carrying Black Lives Matter inspired banners. That's taking Black leadership. That's what we asked white folks to do, and they're doing it. And so I think that is a great political victory of the movement.
Glenn, today we see the capitalist system faced with more crises that they have no solution for. They are in the midst of, even before the COVID-19 crisis, a recession, massive evictions, the threat of nuclear war, the catastrophic looming of global warming, a pandemic for which they have no solutions that has taken the lives of 180,000 people in the United States alone, a catastrophic economy that has a labor participation rate of 50%. Capitalism doesn't seem to have any answers other than more repression, more cutbacks, more layoffs, more funding of the fossil fuel industry, more corporate bailouts. What's happening today in the United States? Is there a way out for the capitalists? Is this an opportunity for radicals and revolutionaries to chart a new course?
Well, we always have an opportunity. The trick is to do the right thing at the right time, but we always have the opportunity. But what you just described is why the Democrats have nothing to offer except to say that they are not Trump, and all Trump has to offer is threats and bombast against Black people and other non-whites. And that's it in terms of the politics of the duopoly ruling class parties in the 21st century, because the way the rulers see the future is that there can be only never-ending war and never-ending austerity. They have nothing to offer but that. They're not going to make any kind of bargain with labor, as folks talk about in the 50s. It really wasn't a bargain with labor. These were concessions that were won by working people in the 30s and 40s, but it's called this bargain. However you want to interpret that era, there's not going to be any such thing in the current era. For the last 30, 40 years, we've been under an austerity regime that has made the fabulously rich ridiculously richer, and they're liking it like that. And they're not going to change the regime. We're in the race to the bottom, and the trick of the Democrats is to convince the people in their base that they're somehow going to stop this race without any real programmatic proposals to do so. The Republicans Trump especially, he doesn't have that problem. He just rants and raves against Black folks. And that section of white America that is satisfied with that is, well, they feel good about themselves. And that's all you have to do for them.
Glenn, your publication is groundbreaking in that it is perhaps among the few that clearly, under your leadership, goes after this two-party system like never before. It goes after the Democrats as well as the Republicans, saying they have no solutions. And yet we have these multiple crises. If you were to close your eyes for a moment and imagine where we would be a year from now, when there is some kind of vaccine that allows us to go back into the streets if they ever find one, when the lessons of these mass mobilizations are drawn, when the wars continue, when the layoffs and evictions increase, when the new government, whichever it is, Biden or Trump, begins to enact the cutbacks to pay back the debts. What kind of fight back can you envision in the months and years ahead? What kind of fight back would you hope for? What kind of organizations do you think will emerge in the coming period? Or will we go back to the contradiction that we face today? Massive anger on the one hand, and the absence of an organizational alternative in life that has the potential to challenge the system as a whole.
I'm quite optimistic about a people's movement becoming much, much stronger in the future. I believe that many of those 20 million or so people, and even folks who didn't get in the street themselves, have had their eureka moment. They have seen the light and the dark, and they understand enough about the nature of the system to want to oppose it. Those folks were marching in the wake of an unprecedented contagion that showed that this country has no national health care system at all, that it is incapable of defending its own citizens against a contagious disease, and is therefore, in many ways, an illegitimate regime. And we were immediately plunged into a Great Depression. And then we have yet again videos of a police atrocity. And police atrocities are always what set Black communities in motion since 1935 with the Harlem Rebellion. So we had this confluence of things happening. And many minds were changed, and they will not go back into some dormant state. There's a lot more folks who are ready and willing to act. And that means there's going to be a lot of different organizations. You remember the last great period of grassroots activity 50 years ago. There was a multitude of organizations, and they would tend at critical junctures to come together. And one could then say, there was this kind of movement and that kind of movement. That's going to happen again this time, only there's a whole lot more people who will be taking part in that whirlwind of activity.
You know, the thing that astonished me most about these past several months was the impact of millions in the streets on the consciousness of the entire population. CNN, for example, did a report where they said that 84% of the American people support the mobilizations against systemic racism. That's a figure that no one has ever dreamed of in the past. You had the racist statues, the exposure of the racist genocidal history of the United States before our eyes. George Washington was no longer on his white horse. He was a slave owner who extracted teeth of blacks for his own. He was part of the monstrous slavocracy that destroyed physically the lives of millions of Blacks in the country. The statues were torn down. They were torn down, their portraits, from the halls of Congress. People who had gone around life with a fairy tale view of our founding fathers, brought forth a nation, with liberty and justice for all, begin to understand the history and origins of this country and their present expression in the institutionalized racism of the police. That qualitatively changed consciousness, in my opinion. It dovetailed with the consciousness that was revealed with the statistics of COVID-19, massive unemployment. 1 out of 5 families has virtually no health care, can't feed their children, can't pay their rent, lives paycheck to paycheck. That's a picture that none of us imagined, other than a few in the socialist movement, because it was hidden with the veneer of stability. We have the lowest unemployment rate in the world. We have a rising stock market. We have prosperity, so they told us, until COVID-19. And then the massive anti-racist movement revealed that we live in basically a sick society where the majority have little of the fundamental necessities for a decent life in this country. That massive mobilization changed consciousness. My question is there a way that this new consciousness, and I believe, or expression of a collective expression of a consciousness that existed that's now in the streets, will give way, open the door to the formation of all kinds of parties, not just Socialist Action, Revolutionary Socialist Party, which is growing by leaps and bounds, but all kinds of political organizations that have the potential of coming together, United Front style, and changing the consciousness, not only on the fundamental questions of racism and poverty, but on which class shall rule this society. What's your take on where we're going? What's your crystal ball? Tell us about the opportunities that this new consciousness allows us to consider.
Well, it is happening. It is what you're talking about is already underway, and existing left parties will get bigger. I think that new left parties will also struggle to be born, and we will also see folks who are in various left and Black organizations coming together, not necessarily in some kind of broad united front. That's a very difficult thing to do and not necessary at all stages of our activity, but coming together behind basic questions, movements for, and I'm going back to it again, community control of the police. And if you get folks in a movement that is in fact in opposition to the Democratic Party in your city, that is for community control of police, and you're speaking the language of self-determination, and you're speaking the language of folks having rights to services and democratic rights to determine what kind of services these will be. You are actually having a socialist conversation with these people, as well as a self-determinationist democratic conversation with these folks, and in opposition to the false Democrats in the Democratic Party. You see, and this is how the politics congeals and gets to the stage when we can actually be talking about broad united fronts based on shared principles. People get shared principles, develop shared principles when they're in shared struggle.
I appreciate that. Glenn, a final question, another crystal ball question for you. People are saying that Trump is the worst monster, racist, bigot, fascist, sexist, homophobic president that we've ever seen. And that in the face of this impending fascism, in quotes, we got to dump him. We got to support Joe Biden. We got to hold our nose as if Joe Biden presents an alternative. Of course, that's not my view. I believe it's not yours as well. But what can we say to those people, those sadly many, many people who see in the re-election of Trump the coming of fascism in the United States, as opposed to a simple, vulgar expression of the crisis of capitalism and a willingness, a need on the part of a few to tighten the screws in order to extract even more from workers than the wing of the ruling class that the Democrats at least publicly talks about. My view is that there's no difference, that it's the same ruling class and that Trump is an aberration and that he does not represent the fascist threat that Trump appears to oppose. But in any case, I don't think that this movement should be railroaded once again to the lesser evil in order to save ourselves from the designated fascists of our times. We were told that we had to support LBJ to stop Barry Goldwater, and we had to support ex-candidate to stop Nixon, to stop the Bushes and so on. What's your overall take on this debate, whether fascism is coming, whether or not the elections are going to solve anything?
Well, you asked several questions there. Let me just answer the first one, the implicit question in your statement, and that is, I tell people that if they participate in this Republican Democratic farce, in the end, or the only thing that's going to change is there won't be Trump. But nothing policy-wise will change. Nothing that impacts upon your life will change. You just won't have Trump in your face, making you angry all the time, as he does by design. But that's it. In terms of fascism, I don't go around using the term fascism exclusively on Trump. Trump is a fascist of the old kind. I have said many times that the Jim Crow regime in the South was a fascist regime, and it fits all of the particulars of European fascism, a one-party state organized against the other in service of the most reactionary elements of the bourgeoisie, resorting often to mob rule, a whole list. It fits the fascist picture than many of the European fascist regimes do. So we in the United States invented fascism, and Hitler many times spoke of how he thought of the United States Jim Crow regime as being a model for what he was trying to build in Germany. So that's the kind of fascist that Trump is, and that's the kind of appeal that he has. But there is a much more modern fascism that the Democratic Party and non-Trump Republicans represent. This corporate late stage fascism. It's the fascism, not the Trump kind, that put Black Agenda Report on a list of websites that serve some kind of foreign power, a ridiculous charge, and 15 other websites. And I'm sure that in the 4 years since that list was promulgated by the Washington Post, there are a lot more organizations on that list. It was Barack Obama who did what George Bush didn't even dare to do. He got Congress to pass legislation for preventive detention without trial of American citizens, a basic element of a police state rule. And lots of Black folks have been saying for a very long time that we have had a fascist type police state regime in Black communities forever. So I don't just play around with this fascist term, and when I do use it, it certainly is not just for Donald Trump.
Glenn, I want to thank you deeply for your participation. I have my own advertisement, and then we'll ask for yours. You can reach us at our website, socialistaction.org. And mention that Glenn and I and Alice Walker and Mumia Abu Jamal and many others have drafted a manifesto for our times, where we go from here. We're asking people to sign this in order to continue to encourage the discussions that we've had today, where we go from here. You can email us at socialjusticemanifesto2020@gmail.com. We'll send you a copy and you can sign on if you like. Thanks, Glenn Ford. You have the last word. I deeply appreciate our friendship and your participation today.
Thanks, Jeff. Mine will be short and sweet. Black Agenda Report has been in operation since 2006. We have a new issue available on the internet every Wednesday. You can find it at www.blackagendareport.com.
Thank you and good afternoon, good evening in New York City.